Hello and welcome to the Value of Testing podcast. My name is Randy Rice, your host, and today we're going to be talking about the value of defects. Now, hang with me through this episode, and hopefully by the end of it, you're going to see some really key ways that you could not only be showing the value of testing, but that you might be able to recoup some of the money that defects are going to cost you. Now, you might be thinking, what's this guy thinking? You know, after all, defects cost money. They can cause loss of reputation and even things that maybe can't be measured in hard dollars. But just hang with me for a minute, and I'm going to explore this topic with you. You know, this podcast is all about the value of testing and how do we show that value, how do we realize it, and ultimately, how does it benefit the people that we work for, and how does it benefit your career? Well, my understanding of this whole idea of the value of defects actually started many, many years ago. I was at a client site, and I was working with this organization. I was going to be doing some training for them, and in the exchange of email and all that, I noticed a tagline that really caught my attention. And the tagline said, "Defects are good." And so I really had to process that when I first saw it. And it was used throughout the organization. It was like a culture thing for this organization. And so I asked my client, to explain their thinking about why they saw defects as good things, because my thinking up until that point was that defects were only bad. And please understand that I'm not suggesting that you promote defects or that you encourage defects or those kind of things. But the reality is that we're going to have defects, and you might as well get the best benefit from those defects. So my client explained to me the way that they came about this concept and this ethic that they actually had was that, yeah, defects, they cost money, they increase risk or they add risk. But when you think about it, every defect that you find either early or at least before a customer finds it, there's some value there. Now, if you're the producer of something, the value there is that if you have a higher quality product, it's going to have a better reputation. But when that defect is found early, then the cost to fix it is substantially less, of course, than if you find it later in the project. And now, if you're the customer, and I always like to break this down, kind of things that happen on the producer side and things that happen on the customer side. So if you're the customer, the value of the defect could be found in that your customer is not going to experience the problems of that defect. You're not going to have the frustrations. It's not going to cost you the time that it might with that defect out there in the product. Let me circle back around to this comment that I just made a few seconds ago about that we're always going to have defects. Nothing's perfect, okay? People are always going to make mistakes because we're human. Now, at one point in time, there was a quality movement back in the 1990s and maybe even earlier than that, a little bit into the 80s. But the idea that was promoted in a lot of that was zero defects. And, maybe in manufacturing, if you have some hard requirements, when I say hard, I mean very specific, well-defined requirements, that you might be able to reach that. You may have heard of Six Sigma and other approaches that really kind of get down to at least a very, very low defect count. But for most of us, defects are going to be a fact of life with what we have to work with at the present, the tools, the people, the processes, and the whole idea here is that, yes, zero defects would be great, but I don't think they're achievable. If for no other reason, just think about all the non-functional aspects of software that you could find a defect in. I mean, the product could work perfectly fine. It could be correct, in other words, but maybe someone just might not like it. They might not find it usable, or it might not fit their need. And actually, there's a name for this. It's called the absence of errors fallacy. And it's one of the general principles of testing that we teach in the ISTQB foundation course. So just keep that in mind, that, as much as we would like to try to get away from defects, we're probably going to have them. The question is, what are we going to do with the defects that we find? Now, this whole notion of defects having value really supports that we need a better view of defects. So the thing about it is, when you see defects as only negative things, then you'll often see things like blame, and you'll see penalties sometimes imposed upon people for defects. And even Dr. Deming, who was one of the founding fathers of the quality movement, once said that people create defects and get paid well for doing so. But he also saw a great value in the prevention of defects. So I've been training and consulting in testing for a long time. And the idea of finding defects, that will be accepted all day long. Finding defects, fixing them, finding them, fixing them. We've kind of even get into a cycle of finding and fixing, and never really looked to see why those defects occurred. The idea of defect prevention just falls on deaf ears sometimes, unfortunately. I have a reason for that, and I don't know what your thinking on this is, but my reason that I think people don't appreciate the idea of defect prevention is because they just don't have time. They will say, well, we need to get to the next sprint, or we need to get to the release point. And then once you get to that point, you're already starting a new sprint or new release cycle, or something like that. Now, some other kind of interesting things that happen here with defects is that, sometimes people will kind of hoard them or sit on them until the very last minute of a release, and then they'll report them to kind of look like a hero. I know that sounds weird, but it sometimes does happen. And in fact, on the developer side, some developers kind of revel in a reputation of being kind of like the person that comes in as the hero and fixes things when things go wrong. Now, one other thing to think about on this is that, defects, yes, they do cost us money. In fact, the cost of defects in production has risen dramatically over just the last few years. Several years ago, the cost was around, I think, $4,500 US per production defect on average. Now, as of this recording, the average is more like about $16,000 US per production defect. Now, of course, you're going to experience different costs depending upon your situation, and probably not enough people measure this to really truly have the accurate cost. And it does consider defects like security defects, which can actually run into the millions of dollars. I often talk about the famous NASDAQ defect with the Facebook IPO that now it's over, I believe, $60 million that defect, that one performance defect alone cost. So yes, the defects cost us money, but let's think about that $16,000 per production defect. If you were to find 10 defects in your testing, and that may actually be a pretty low number for you, I don't know, but at that point you've saved the organization roughly around $160,000. Now that's a lot of value from testing. You may be thinking, hey, I need a raise. I don't blame you. I would be thinking that too. The thing is, though, very few testers actually communicate this value message to their management. And therefore the value of testing and testers, it just goes unrealized. And you never know. Sometimes management, as we've seen in some cases recently, they say, well, AI is going to find all the defects, or we're going to automate all of this, and the automation is going to find all the defects, and which is a total fallacy, because automation typically does not discover defects. It will confirm many times that your tests are running as you hope they would, like with regression tests. Now, one other interesting side note here, in my opinion at least, in the manufacturing world, they talk about defects before and after going to market. And like during the manufacturing process, they call rework, which is what you would have in fixing a defect or problem or something, they actually call that waste. And yes, reworking things. If you've ever been in that position of being a developer or having to do something again, especially at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, it just becomes almost an infuriating kind of experience, because you wonder, why didn't we find this before we released it, or why didn't the testers find it, or what's causing this, why can't we prevent these things? And this idea of waste, sometimes people don't even consider the cost of defects before production, but they do cost you money. Okay, depending on when you find them, whether it be in coding or testing or a UAT or something like that. In fact, it's known as the 1-10-100 rule, where if it takes 1 hour to deal with a defect in requirements or design, it might take 10 times that much to deal with that same defect in late stage testing, and over 100 times as much once you get out into production. Well, there's a lot that we can learn from defects, but this is one of the things that I would consider to be one of the biggest gaps in testing, where people just fail to look at the root cause of the defects they're actually finding. Once again, the excuse that you're probably going to hear most of the time is, we don't have time to do it. There's an old adage that says, we don't have time to do it right, but we always have time to do it over. And that's really true, I think. But here are some of the things that you can do to see the value of defects. First of all, see it as a prevention mechanism for future problems. And this goes to the root cause example again, that if you could actually take even a category of defects that you're finding and do some true root cause analysis to find out, why did this event happen? Why did this failure happen? Why did this mistake happen? That kind of thing. Then you can start looking at the reasons behind that and hopefully address those. So you're not just simply finding and fixing the same kind of defects just time after time. Now, I always tell people, if you really want to take that very first step in process improvement based on defects, start a bug collection. Categorize the kind of defects that you see, such as computational defects, or maybe data validation or edit kind of defects, perhaps usability defects, or logical decision kind of defects. There's a whole taxonomy of bugs out there that you can find. Boris Beiser had one, James Whitaker has some, Kim Kainer had one in his books. That if all you have to do is just do a web search on software bug taxonomy or defect taxonomy, and you'll find that. So once you can start to find the most common types of defects in your projects, your organization, then you can start picking them off, the biggest area first, then the next after that, then the next after that. So that's one thing, okay? The other thing you can do to show the value of defects is think about maybe relative improvement. And when you work on a project or maybe a series of projects, one of the questions that often comes up is, are we getting any better? Okay, the overall quality, are we just doing the same thing the same way, making the same mistakes? And, defect metrics can be very elusive to track. One of the reasons for that is that the defects have to be relative to something to yield some meaningful information. If I just simply tell you, on this release we had 50 defects, and on this release we had 30 defects, and so forth, you really don't know what that means until you make it relative to something, perhaps the size of something. Now, lines per code is really slippery, really deceiving, because each language has different ways of really interpreting the number of lines of code. Some languages actually result in quite a few lines of code, and maybe doing the same thing in a different language would be less. So they came up with function points back many years ago as a way to just count functionality in something. That might be one way to do that. But here's another thought for you. I don't know if you've heard of defect detection percentage, DDP, but that is basically the number of defects you find in your testing pre-release divided by the total number of defects found life of the release, both your testing and found after release. So let's say you find 85 defects in your testing before release in all forms: reviews, unit testing, system testing, acceptance, and then after release 15 other defects are found that you didn't find earlier. Maybe they're found by the customer, by the support team, or whoever, even by maybe a tester later. You do some monitoring and you catch it. So that case, you'd add that 15 to the 85, that would give you 100. So 85 divided by 100 expressed as a percentage there would be 85% would be your DDP. Now, this number does you no good whatsoever in the project that you're on at the time, okay, because you're not at release point yet. And in fact, you have to go for a certain period of time after release before you can actually truly get a solid reading on the number of defects found post-release. But what it can tell you is, if you look at it release by release by release over a period of time, you can tell, is the DDP increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it totally unpredictable? All of those can tell you something about your processes and also about your effectiveness of testing. Okay, so that's another thing. Now, another thing about the value of defects is that they give you great insight into your project status. And it's a kind of like an open thing where everyone can see the number of defects and how severe they are, what state they're in terms of being fixed and all that. And so you can kind of see this on a dashboard, and you can see the rate of defect finding, and you can see all kinds of things that give you insight into how are we doing on the project, what is the product like, and that's a really good thing, of course, unless the decision has been made to release regardless of defects, and that's another discussion to be had. But the ability to see this as a dashboard item and to know how many unresolved serious defects or major defects we have, that is a direct indicator of risk, and that's something that should be taken into account. It should be the most valuable piece of advice or information that the tester can give to the project manager or the Scrum Master or whoever is really leading into the release decision. Now, one final thing that you can think about here for the value of defects is the ability to predict and estimate things based on the number of defects that you've seen in the past. That's the thing that you need to have some historical background of defects in your own organization to kind of know what the trends are and what you can expect in the release that you're in right now or a future release cycle or something like that. And in some cases, it may take a long time actually to gather this information to get really good at predicting defect trends. Now, if you're not there, if you're not measuring defects or you haven't been measuring them very deeply for very long, don't feel bad. To me, this is kind of like an extra thing that you can get. I think that you're going to get most of your value of defects from the other things that I mentioned. Defect prediction and estimation can be a bit tricky, so you kind of have to take care of that. But probably the best thing I can tell you about the prediction is if you can come up with a prediction curve of how fast you expect to find the defects and that kind of thing, and plot that against how fast you're actually finding defects or you're discovering them, however you want to say that, then that can give you some great insight. There's one other thing too I want to throw in here as kind of a bonus. The defect backlog can give you tremendous information about how your project is going. In fact, that may be one of the most important things that you can look at. The backlog of defects would be the defects that the developers are still working on. They're not closed out yet. They haven't been retested yet. And if you have a defect backlog that is just continually climbing, you've basically got a patient there in cardiac arrest. You've got a situation where all you're doing in your testing is you're just piling on to the pile of defects. Now, I know management, they always want to see progress, right? They want to see that you're moving forward, making time toward your goals and all of that. They do not like to hear that we need to pause testing. Maybe you can refocus testing or something like that. But I'm going to tell you, when all you do is find defects you're adding onto the pile, all you're doing is making more work for yourself later. And you're overwhelming the developers. The more you overwhelm them, the less ability they're going to have to fix the defects at hand. So they just get swamped. I was on a project once that we found an extremely high number of defects very early in our acceptance testing, and that was like a tsunami of defects heading towards the developers. It overwhelmed the developers. They could never really recover from it. The business, the vendor who was creating this software, could never recover from it. The company went bankrupt, and it left about 40 or more jurisdictions across the United States without the support of the software that this company made. It was like a catastrophic failure, one of the worst software project failures I've ever seen. So take great care about that defect backlog. And the best thing you can do, once again, is to try to pull back a little bit on what you're reporting as defects, because once again, if you just keep adding onto the pile, that's not good for anybody. So the bottom line here is, if you look at defects in a value added way, in that, yes, even though there's a cost to defects and they can be frustrating and they can be annoying and they can actually increase risk and do some very bad things. And so I'm certainly not proposing a lax attitude toward defects, but if you can get this value view of defects, then at least you can take advantage of the benefit that you can see from the information that you're gaining out of the defects that you find. And hopefully they can be a catalyst for process improvement, so that you're not even in this discussion anymore about how do we take the bad and make it good, okay? Maybe you can actually get to that point to where you can say, we've taken the bad and now we've used it and we've made it good, and we have a very defined, repeatable, and very low defect kind of process that we're using. So I hope this information has been of value to you. Of course, you know the deal. If you like my channel, please subscribe. I would appreciate that. Give me a thumbs up if you like this episode, and feel free to share this with your friends, your other testers, your developers, if you think this might be helpful to you, or maybe a project manager or two might could benefit from this. Okay, well, hey, it's been a pleasure being with you today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for watching.